All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the long-awaited worst president's decisions of all time stream. And I know a lot of you have commented in the past that you enjoy the Chris Richardson streams. It's been a few months now, but I'm so glad to say that we have Chris Richardson back with us today to discuss this topic. Hey, Chris.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. I see you've got Abe sitting behind
I
you
do
there.
have Abe Lincoln right behind me.
What's that map?
That is a map of the United States and all the influence that Spain had on it. So it's all the different cities in America that are named after Spanish cities.
Oh, that's really cool. It's something that's not talked about a lot in the history of the United States, the Spanish Empire and our relationship with it.
Yeah. All over America, in every state, there's at least like a new Madrid and a new Malaga and Las Vegas. And there's lots of cool places that also share Spanish city names. So I use it to remind me of my time in Spain.
Ah, that's cool. I like it.
Yeah.
So, as I said earlier, we have a very important topic, a very interesting topic, something I've been wanting to talk about for a while and wanted to talk about with somebody who knows their presidential history. And so today we're going to talk about...
Not as good as you, but...
We'll see about that. I don't know. You check me a lot, so we'll see. But we're going to talk about the worst presidential decisions. Chris and I may kind of debate a little bit about them just to kind of make it interesting. I think Barack Obama in his recent book was talking about, as president, you're often given a choice between the worst possible decision and another worst possible decision. So we're going to keep in mind that presidents don't always have control over what comes to their desk. But taking the Harry Truman adage of the buck stops here at the president, we are going to hold them accountable for their bad decisions, even if it wasn't totally their fault. So we're going to start by showing, I'm going to start by revealing the two lists. I made a list and Chris made a list of the decisions, the top five. Mine is on the right and his is on the left. So now I'm going to reveal our picks.
Ooh, drum roll.
Bam. So again, that's Chris on the left and me on the right.
Wow, what a list.
Yeah.
Wow.
Real quick answer to your question. The most vetoes was Franklin Roosevelt, just like everything else, the most of. But the most for the shortest amount of time was Grover Cleveland.
Yeah. He vetoed everything.
Yeah. So he did the most in the shortest amount of time. Yeah. So
so
what do you think?
That's an interesting list. I want to hear about so I think that we both kind of picked W invading Iraq, but I would like to hear, but I ended up not picking that just because you already had it on your list. Why don't you talk a little bit about it? Like, why did you pick W's invasion of Iraq?
Well, of course, it's a highly charged emotional topic for me because it was something I lived through. And I lived through it at a time when I was becoming very politically conscious. So bear that in mind. But I chose W invading Iraq because I can't think of a situation that was less necessary, something that could have been so easily avoided. It really, there's a lot of situations in history where you look at a president and you see that like, oh, I can see why they made that horrible decision, but it was still a horrible decision. With Bush, it seems like you have an active attempt to do something. Like everyone basically is sort of like everyone was minding their own business, and the Bush administration went out of its way to make this war take place. The reasons they gave: WMDs, no WMDs were found. Connection to Al Qaeda. Not only did they not find evidence that that Saddam Hussein was connected to Al Qaeda, but there's actually a lot of moments in history where Osama bin Laden offered help in fighting against Iraq.
Saddam actually hated him, and Saddam saw Al Qaeda as a threat to his, because the Ba'ath Party was actually very secularist, whereas Osama bin Laden wanted this Islamic caliphate. And so anyone who had an understanding of like the Middle East would understand that these two men did not get along, and yet it happened anyway.
Yeah. And it was so obvious at the time when the lead up to the war was taking place that these people who were constructing this case for war really just did not understand the history, and they were treating Iraq as though it was some sort of theocracy of Iraqis, right? That the Iraqi, some people named Iraqis formed a theocracy called Iraq that wants to destroy America, when it's like that country was actually carved out by Great Britain and the United States after World War I.
We'll get to that. That's under my worst decision.
Oh, right. Sorry, I don't want to step on your toes there. But like, it is I think for Osama bin Laden after 9/11, he actually had a statement. Actually, Owen Symes is in the chat, and I read it in his book on President Obama, where he basically was like, when Bush decided to invade Iraq, he was like, this is going to be the graveyard of empire. He's going to spill blood and treasure for nothing. And, in some ways, Osama got what he wanted out of Bush by him invading Iraq.
I'll say that when I think about the Iraq War, and I do think it's like one of the worst decisions in American history, but the two things that jump out at me is that 75% of Americans actually supported the invasion at the time. It was fairly easy to get, and I think it's funny that in hindsight, so many Americans are like, oh, I never supported the war. I always had doubts. In fact, that's not true. Most Americans actually supported the war. Most demographics supported the war. Interestingly, the only demographic of people who did not support the war were African Americans. I think like 75% of everybody else in America was like, yeah, let's go do this. About 60-70% of African Americans were like, no, we think this is a horrible idea. Right. I know for me, I think that the reason why I thought it was a horrible idea is because it is the representation of what I think of as like almost like a white supremacist ideal that we as America or we as white people can go and fix anything going on in the world. I think that they looked at this country, they looked at these people, they're like, we can go in there, we can fix this stuff. Whereas I think a lot of us, African Americans, whoever looked at it, were like, you can't even fix like the potholes down in South Bend. What do you mean you're going to go and remake this entire country that's been this way forever? And then even a lot of the arguments just didn't make any sense, right? Because I remember Bush was like, well, they have this WMD, but they're not going to use it on our soldiers. And I'm like, wait a minute. So you're telling me that this man has WMD, but he's not going to use it while being invaded by our country? That made no sense, right? Or even the idea that somehow like, oh, this guy Saddam's like the worst guy out there. And it's just like North Korea, China and its gulags, Iran, Belarus, like there's just so many different countries out there that are just make terrible decisions against their people. But it's just that this one guy was the one that we're like, oh, we can take him. This is easy enough. But I think it's just like, it really speaks to this. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the War of 1812, but it speaks to this part of our character as a country that's largely deficient, in which we think that we have this ability to do everything and anything abroad that we choose to. And that more times often than not, it really bites us in the butt. And Iraq's a perfect example of that. You think about the trillions of dollars we spent on that country, and why, as you said, it wasn't for anything at this point.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into the War of 1812 then, since that was your number one worst decision of all time, James Madison's declaration of war. What caused you to want to pick the War of 1812 specifically?
Because that was really the first American. That was the first time America showed this character of, we're going to do whatever the hell we want, and no one's going to stop us, right? And so, just as a little bit of context for those who don't remember AP history, the British were basically impressing American soldiers at that time, which impressing means like British naval ships would basically go, they'd find an American ship, and they would take Americans off the ship, and they would put them in the service of the British Empire, which at that time had been fighting against Napoleon. And so basically in 1811, 1812, there were this group called they were called the War Hawks, basically. Henry Clay and John Calhoun, these really young people who were like, oh man, we're so tired of the British impressing our soldiers. We're going to have to do something about this. And so they really revved up America through journalism, through speeches, into this idea that we could take on the British Empire, which at that time had been stuck in a war against Napoleon. And so in a sense, America allied itself with Napoleon to basically fight against the British. And so Madison declared, and the reason why I think it's a mistake is because a president's job should be to calm tempers. right? Like McKinley tried to do that in the Spanish-American War, largely unsuccessful. But Martin Van Buren did that when the USS Caroline was seized by the British or destroyed by the British in 1837. There have been instances where, there have been tempers flaring, and the president, like Lincoln, a lot of people wanted to fight against the British or against the French, when the French invaded Mexico during the Civil War. And Lincoln said one war at a time. So a job of a president is to calm stuff down. Madison was like, no, I'm going to ride this wave. And what happened is that Detroit got seized. We lost Canada, which we shouldn't have even been trying to take Canada. Washington was burned. the Capitol was burned. The White House was burned. And we got like this huge amount of debt. It really sowed the seeds of distrust between the North and the South, because the North, all of the northern states where the Federalist Party was located, basically saw this as an attempt by a lot of the southern and western states at expansion, but they used the impressment thing as an excuse. And the worst thing is that we went to war over impressment and nothing happened with that, right? The only reason impressment went away is because the British won the war. They won their war against Napoleon. But otherwise, the British were kind of like, we're going to impress whatever we want. We're going to do whatever we want. And so I think that Americans, we look at this war, though, and we're like, oh, this was such a success. The war was actually a disaster for the United States. And so I think that in that way, it was one of my top worst decisions by a president.
Yeah, I mean, hey, we did get the Star Spangled Banner out of it, so that's pretty cool. I did a video on the War of 1812 once, and it is the ultimate like war we lost but said we won. And I think that although that's a ridiculous statement to make, I can understand, at least to some degree, the idea that the 1812 war, the British did end up not reconquering. They didn't reconquer us, and
no,
so that's
Johnny, no, you don't declare war on another country, and then you're like, well, at least they didn't beat us. At least they didn't take us back, right? No, that doesn't work that way. Like if the British had declared war on us and we repelled them, that's one thing, right? That's one thing. No, we went out of our way the British were basically trying to stop Napoleon from conquering Europe. Yeah. And America's like, oh, you're taking some of our soldiers. We're going to declare war on you. And then we get our ass handed to us. They burn the White House, right? And where was the president when this is all going on? The president takes the field. Madison takes the field. I guess you give him credit for that. He takes the field to fight against the British. Within 2 minutes, he's like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not a general. What am I doing here? And I tailed it, left his wife, Dolly, back at the White House. And she's the one that had to take down and take all the stuff and get out of the house, right? And so, no, having your Capitol burned, having your White House burned, having Detroit burned, and being like, well, at least they didn't take us. That isn't a victory at all. That's like the most ridiculous argument. I hear this argument all the time, and it's just like that one, and like, well, we had national pride from it. It's just like,
yeah,
pride in what exactly?
In retrospect, like all the songs and everything, and just pretending we won it. Actually, it turns out the power of positive thinking actually does work in this country.
Yeah, I guess so.
So our number 2 pick was the same, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Can you explain a little bit about what the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is? Because you probably know it better than I do.
I probably don't, but I'll try. Yeah. So basically what happened is that, the United States have been fighting or trying to other countries have been trying to uphold this South Vietnam, or this idea of a U.S. or Western allied South Vietnam, really since 1946, but really even back to 1919, when Ho Chi Minh went to meet with Woodrow Wilson to ask for a country, and Woodrow Wilson was like, screw you. And so, there was always this country. So first the French did the fighting, but then the French lost in Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and then America kind of took it over from there. And so the war gradually escalated. And in the Gulf of Tonkin basically was the U.S. had a naval ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. The North Vietnamese allegedly had a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. The first incident, there were 2 incidences in the Gulf of Tonkin. First one on August, I think 2nd, 1965. What basically happened is that, or 1964, 1965. So anyway, what basically happened is that either the Maddox fired on the North Vietnamese ship, or the North Vietnamese ship fired on us. No one knows. The second incident was completely made up, never happened. But basically Johnson used both incidences to go and get this Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, which allowed him basically to have an open-ended invitation to basically fight this long, protracted war against the Vietnamese population, the South Vietnamese population. And the reason why I picked that as a really terrible decision was because it was basically made out of whole cloth, like several of our wars, but also because in many ways it betrayed our instincts as a country. In the 1950s, Ho Chi Minh offered to do like a nationwide vote in Vietnam. He's like, you know what? Let the people of Vietnam decide who they wanted as they're running the country as a whole. And the reason why Eisenhower didn't do that is because he knew that if you actually give the people of Vietnam a choice, they probably would all pick Ho Chi Minh. And so I think that as a country, we probably sided against our own interest in deciding to back this country that we knew wasn't going to be successful and wouldn't last, and it ultimately didn't. And also the fact that we spent the blood and the treasure and really distracted from the war on poverty and the civil rights movement in the name of Vietnam. And you think about what our country would look like if we didn't have a Vietnam. If you had a civil rights movement that was united with the Johnson administration, if we had avoided all the mistakes that we did by getting into this war, like how much we could have invested in our own country, and how that dream never happened, largely because of the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Well, I have a counterpoint to blaming LBJ for all of this, because I want you to check this clip out here. I'm gonna like defer to an elder here and have our friend Gore Vidal say a few words about why he thinks the Vietnam War happened. And I'd be curious to get your reaction to this statement. Check it out.
And we must put this on President Kennedy's head. He got us into it in October '63 when he changed the 600 advisors we had there to 20,000 committed troops. It is now part of the Kennedy legend that had he lived, this war would not have taken place, or would not have pursued, it would not have escalated. I can promise you, as much as you can guess anything, I mean, of a speculative nature, that he would have been as deeply in it as Johnson.
What do you think about the idea that it's really Kennedy who should be blamed for Vietnam?
Well, then you can blame any president for anything. It's the president that actually did the action that has to be blamed for it, right? And then also when you think about Kennedy was different than Johnson in that Johnson was more of like a go home or go broke kind of guy. Kennedy was actually very cautious in most of his actions. Even if you look at the Bay of Pigs resolution, how that all resolved with us removing the Juniper missiles from Turkey. At the end of the day, Kennedy was very, very pragmatic, and I don't think that Kennedy would have escalated the war to the extent that Johnson did. But even outside of that, Kennedy's dead in November of 1963, but Johnson is very much alive in 1965, and so he's the one that chose to push the button to put the numbers into it, and Nixon decided to continue it even after he won the election. 30,000 American soldiers died under Johnson, but 20,000 more died under Nixon.
Right, and he obstructed peace negotiations as well to try to beat Hubert Humphrey in '68.
Yep. That's true too. Another bad decision.
That could be another bad decision. All right, so we're gonna move on from the Vietnam War now. Let's go back to our screen here of worst decisions. So I'll talk about my number 3, and then we'll go to World War I, since it's chronological here. I do like that you have Wilson twice. That's very on brand for you.
I hated Wilson.
Basically, everything Wilson did could have been the top 5 for you, I feel like.
Pretty much.
But going to war with the Philippines. Now, you mentioned we were talking about George W. Bush earlier in the invasion of Iraq, and the idea that presidents are supposed to cool temperatures. And you mentioned McKinley specifically as somebody who cooled temperatures.
Tried to cool temperatures, but then gave up.
Yeah. What's interesting is Karl Rove actually looked at McKinley as the chief influence for his campaign for George W. Bush. He loves McKinley, and he wrote a book on McKinley, and he's obsessed with him. But he seems to miss like the fundamental thing that McKinley was a reluctant invader at first. He did not want to go to war with Spain. He tried to cool temperatures, as you say. He was one of the last holdouts in the entering the Spanish-American War. But ultimately, the whatever it was between the businesses and all of the clamorings for war and the yellow press, and then the explosion of the Maine, the American vessel in Havana Harbor, which
fiction, more fiction.
looked like it was not really, it wasn't an attack. It was just something blew up because the ships were really, they were kind of a new type of ship, and they weren't very good at making these types of ships, and they had a lot of problems like this. So, you know, McKinley tries and tries, but ultimately he fails, and he gives in, and he allows the war to happen. But here's the thing. The Spanish-American War takes place in Cuba. And when all is said and done, like, it's a quick war, a splendid little war, as John Hay says. It's a quick war. And the lesson at the end of that war for Americans is sort of like, oh, we can do this at minimal cost. And when the war is over, the Spanish, who had the territory of Cuba, they give up Cuba, and we occupy it for a few years. But there's a few more territories. There's Guam in the Pacific, and then there's the Philippines. And we had also had an easy time dealing with the Spanish Navy in Manila. So we were riding on this wave of like, we can do this imperialism thing. We could probably do it the American way, you know, where it'll be better than the old type of imperialism. This will be a new type of imperialism that'll be good. And so the question became, you know, what to do about the Philippines now. And the administration was very quick to decide to annex the Philippines and send troops over there to put down the revolutionary movements that were taking place. Now, on the one hand, there was this fear that if the Philippines was just sort of left, and with the Spanish leaving, that there would be a power vacuum that could be filled by any number of countries. Of course, the United States always says that. But so that's the only justification for the Philippines War that was like remotely credible to me. The idea that it was, you know, that the Philippines could be taught could be Christianized and taught self-government by the American definition. You know, this was just your classic imperialist mentality. It was colonialism. It was white supremacy through and through, and it was delusional. And the war was a disaster, especially for the Filipino people, but also for the American soldiers who wrote back these letters where they were just like, we're chopping heads and everything. And it was terrible. We held on to the Philippines until 1946. And I mean, in many ways, our control of the Philippines is what exposed us to the danger of being attacked by Japan as well. You know, but I think that, go ahead.
What's interesting about that war is I don't think that people understand how brutal it was, that this was like the first war where America really set up internment camps where we tortured and killed, you know, thousands of Filipinos. I don't think that people realize just how, and I think it's one of the, when in those letters people would write back home, they often talked about the fact that they were torturing people, and that they took pride about torturing people, doing waterboarding. A lot of like our most brutal techniques were kind of developed in our war in the Philippines. I think Donald Trump even mentioned the Philippines as, you know, he told that story that it wasn't even real, about how you deal with an insurrectionist or whatever. But I think that Americans really not romanticize, but they don't really talk about it. And the reason why we don't really talk about it or study it is because it was such a brutal war that we waged against them.
And of course, as Owen points out, special mention for Teddy Roosevelt, because McKinley died in the middle of this war. It was mostly Teddy's baby. So he should get a special, but he did not make the decision to go in initially.
Right. Yeah.
All right. But someone who did make the decision to go in was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite president of all time, Woodrow Wilson.
You're joking. That was his most hated president of all time.
All right, so Woodrow Wilson and the decision to enter World War I. Wow, I mean, we just had this monument go up, and now you're telling me we shouldn't have gone into World War I?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Guy. So I think it's important to first separate. So our enemy, World War II, obviously, is Hitler, greatest evil in the 20th century, up there with Stalin. But the Kaiser who ran Germany in World War I is an entirely different animal than Adolf Hitler.
True.
I think that you could even go back to the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Like, that's what I would probably start at. You know, in that war, basically Germany or the Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian Empire at that time, they went over, they beat the shit out of France, end of war. and then France had to give up some territory. Bada boom, bada bing, it's over. I said bada boom, bada bing. That's funny.
Hey, I give you the card.
And so, World War I starts with the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand. I'm sure you've talked about how like ironic his assassination was. It wasn't ironic. It was just one of those funny things, because like the assassin threw a bomb in the Archduke's car. The Archduke threw it out, and then basically the Archduke took a wrong turn, and I think the assassin was like having like a sandwich or something, and it was like, oh shit, that's the guy I tried to kill, and pulled out his gun and killed, and that's how the war started, by completely a wrong turn up down the road. But anyway, so when this war happens, you really have two sides, right? You have the Allied powers, and then you had the people, the Central powers, basically. So Germany, Austria were the Central powers, Britain, France were the head of the Allied powers. And these two basically, between 1914 and 1916, 17, really have this brutal war, and it's really at a stalemate. And the problem with America entering that war is that it tipped the scale so thoroughly on the side of the British and French that when they won, you saw the collapse of 4 or 5 empires, actually. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Russian Empire collapsed. Who am I missing? I'm like Rick Perry here. Something else. But yeah, so anyway, you had like these empires that collapsed. And the problem is that a power vacuum actually did fill those empires collapsing. And so when the Ottoman Empire collapses, basically the British and the French are like, you know what, F this, we're going to draw the borders that we want to draw, not based on actual ethnicities or nationalities or ideas of ethnicities, but on what's in the best interest of the French and the British. And so a lot of the divisions a lot of the issues you look at, so for example, Kurds in Kurdistan, the fact that there is no homeland for the Kurds, that stuff is really based on the mistakes of World War I and our entry into that war, which pushed the thumbs on the scale so much of the Allied powers that the Allied powers are basically like, you know what, we're going to punish and destroy Germany. We're going to destroy them. We're going to bankrupt them. And that laid the seeds, of course, for World War II happening. And so what I think would have happened if we didn't get involved in World War I is that these two sides would have fought to their stalemate until they had to make a negotiated peace. And then you would have had these empires still intact. Now, I'm not saying that these empires were perfect, but those empires could have died a natural death, or they could have died in a way that was much less about satisfying the British and French needs, but maybe satisfying what was going on in the Ottoman Empire at that time, or what was going on in the Balkans at that time with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or what was going on that time in Germany, or even like what was going on in Russia. Like I think the fact that we got involved in that war really, and it wasn't really from a military standpoint so much as like a financial standpoint, and also from this idea of a League of Nations and all this make the world safe for democracy BS that we were spreading back then. For me, I think that that's what makes the war. And so all the problems that we saw in the 20th century, all the things that we look at and we're like, man, how did that happen? Really have their roots in World War I and how that all happened. And for me, I think the war would have turned out much differently had the U.S. just stayed out of it, like Wilson promised to do, and he actually campaigned on in 1960. And won on that promise too, and then promptly changed it. And then an inauguration, a month after he's inaugurated, changes his mind about the very thing that he won on.
Yeah, and I think even just talking about it from the perspective of preparation, the United States declared war. We didn't even really show up until like October because it took so long to mobilize. We declared war before we were actually ready, so. It took we declared war. There's a big celebration over on the Allied side. And then they're like, where are these troops?
Yeah.
And it was like, we didn't show up for a really long time. So that was a problem. Our forays at the beginning of the war were very unsuccessful.
Yeah.
We didn't lose nearly as many people as the Europeans, but we could have lost fewer people if things had been done in a more organized fashion. Right. I just think that Wilson had a tenuous grip on power. He had just squeaked by in both of his elections. He was maintaining his coalition of power by, keeping the economy afloat through trading with the Allied powers, sending them food, weapons, and all these things. And as we'll see later with Jefferson's embargo, which is going to be my number 4, you can't trade with Europe when it's having a war and not get your ships blown up by one of the belligerents if you're not trading with them enough, right? So we got blown up. And so I don't agree fully that the decision to go to war was a bad decision. I do think if you think it's a bad decision, you'd have to go all the way back to the moment that Wilson decided to allow the United States to trade with Europe and not to, because Wilson did say we'll trade with Europe, but we'll trade equally. Well, France and Britain are very easy to access by a ship. Germany is in the interior of the country. We sold 10 times more shit to the Allies, and Germany started blowing up our ships, and that's how we got sucked in. So I do feel to a degree we got sucked in, but I'd say if you were against it, you'd have to point to that decision when Wilson was like, yes, we will revive our economy by trading with the warring nations of Europe. And somehow we're going to not get sucked into that.
But I think that the consequences were so dire that's the reason why. Because, like, if you have an intact German empire, you have a Kaiser, you have a king, you don't have the dying Weimar Republic, and you don't have an Adolf Hitler. You might have someone like that later. There's no way to know. But if you have an intact German state that isn't, like, saddled with a shit ton of debt and actually was on equal footing with the allies that they really beat, but for us kind of giving them that impetus to continue the war to no end, I think that you have an entirely different looking 20th century. You might have had the same issues, I don't know. Like, there's no way of knowing that. But I do know that Germany had a power vacuum that was inevitably filled by the Nazis. And that's something that might have been avoided had the Germans actually been able to maintain their empire. Yeah.
So I already previewed my next one, which is Jefferson's embargo. And this is, again, like, you put Madison's decision to enter 1812. You're not going to get 1812 without Jefferson's embargo, I would say. So basically, we talked about the origins of the War of 1812, the fact that Britain and France were fighting against one another. And just like in World War I, the U.S., who was an agricultural exporting nation who would export goods to Europe, were getting, our ships weren't getting blown up, but they were getting commandeered, and our citizens were being impressed into the British Navy. Of course, there weren't really citizenship papers back then, and a lot of British people would fake their American citizenship papers to try to avoid impressment, which is why the British started impressing anyone they found. Because there wasn't really an official way. There wasn't a passport that you could show back in those days. So things were a little loosey-goosey. But Jefferson, basically, he sees that he needs to keep trading with Europe, but that it's going to potentially drag us into war. And of course, George Washington said, don't get involved in Europe's affairs. It's going to ruin the country. Focus on the Western Hemisphere. And so I call this Thomas Jefferson's Yuche, his attempt to do what North Korea did, which was just to say, full stop, we're not trading with Europe anymore. We're just going to have a complete embargo, and we're going to do everything in-house. It's kind of ironic that Jefferson was the one who did that, because it requires a huge, it requires the federal government to get very involved, to tell private businesses and that they cannot trade abroad, and it's a huge invasion of the market to control it that way. But Jefferson thought that he was protecting the country from getting dragged into war by doing this. All it did was pretty much mess up our economy really badly. We had to give up with our hat in hand and say, okay, we're sorry, we're not doing this anymore. And it made us, it emboldened the British to mess with us even more, because we had just done this failed embargo. And Jefferson repealed the embargo the day before Madison gets into office, which is like a pretty shitty thing to do to the guy who's going to replace you. It's just like, here you go. I just lost a trade war. Have fun. And I actually included a little cartoon from the embargo. As you can see, this gentleman is trying to trade some kind of superfine, probably molasses or something, with the British ship. It's anchored offshore. You've got these smugglers over here. We're getting ready to take it over. And this turtle grabs him. And the turtle's name is Oh Grab Me. He says, "Oh, this cursed Oh Grab Me." You may notice that Oh Grab Me is embargo spelled backwards. So that was kind of an interesting little piece right there. So yeah, that would be my pick there.
Okay.
But let's take 1 second. Sorry. Okay. The next decision, number 5, Ford pardoning Nixon.
Oh, no. I still got to go for Wilson staying in office.
Oh, sorry. Wilson staying in office after the stroke. Go for it.
Yeah, but I'll be quick on this one.
Okay.
So basically, in 1919, after the aftermath of World War I, Woodrow Wilson is trying to negotiate this League of Nations to get all these countries together. And in the midst of doing that, he actually has a stroke, a debilitating stroke that kind of leaves him just unable to control his faculties. And, his doctor kind of lies about it. And, allegedly his wife starts to take over, although I think that stuff is kind of overblown. But I think that the problem with Wilson's decision to maintain an office after his stroke is that 1919 is a momentous year in American history. Not only do you have the end of World War I, you have the Spanish flu, which Wilson doesn't really comment on at all. That's killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, or tens of thousands of Americans. You have race riots, the worst race riots in American history at that time. You had the Attorney General's house was firebombed by anarchists, and he's doing these raids on everybody. He's deporting people. He's out of his mind. So you have race riots. The economy is sort of contracting because of the end of World War I. And the thing is that if there's a time for a president, it's during something like this, when you have a year. So the Spanish flu, as bad and horrible as it is, you probably didn't read about it that much in your history books because it was such a bad year, 1919. It was on the list of even though 1919, the Spanish flu in any other year would be like the most important big effing deal, in the words of our president, ever. But we don't even count it as like the third biggest thing of that year because it was such a bad year. And so what you really needed was a president in 1919, and we didn't have a president. And maybe if Wilson was alive, maybe if he hadn't had the stroke, it's possible he wouldn't have done anything about this stuff anyway. But at the very least, maybe Thomas Marshall would have stood up and actually did more than Wilson had done. But I also think it's a mistake because that stroke, it changed Wilson in a way that made him even more Wilsonish, kind of like very set and stern understanding of his ways in a way that I think actually harmed his negotiation. It actually harmed his ability to understand that, hey, maybe I should try to tweak the League of Nations. Maybe I should try to work with these Republicans. Maybe I should try to do. He's just like, no, I'm president of all. And then the idea that he would even run for a third term, which is just insane, right, after suffering a stroke. But I think that for me, the biggest issue is that it gave other presidents after him the idea that they're indispensable. I think that that's like the biggest issue with the modern day presidency is that every president thinks that himself is like basically the country can't do without them. I think you see that with Kennedy running despite his health issues. I think you definitely see that with the fact that FDR ran for 4 terms, knowing he was dying in 1944. Yet still felt, oh, it can only be me or no one else as president. Yeah, and so I think that you see that idea that presidents kind of felt like, well, I have to stay in this office. And I think that really started in Wilson's desire to stay in office. Had he resigned due to a stroke, maybe other presidents after him would have said, okay, I'm sick as well, I can leave too.
Yeah, I think people would have understood, and I think Wilson overestimated how important he himself was to the League fight, and of course, to the fight for the League of Nations, that is, and of course, he was important to that fight, but after his stroke, he was actively obstructing the negotiations, and so he was actually hurting it. It would have been better if he was not around.
Right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think his stroke contributed to that. I think it made him more incorrigible. It made him like a worse in terms of being thinking about this thing clearly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a great story about Albert Fall coming in to visit Wilson during the stroke because there was some conflagration in Mexico going on at the time. And so these Republicans showed up to ask him about it, and they called it the sniffing committee. because they were coming to sniff out how bad things were with Wilson after the stroke. And like they I guess they drugged him up or something, and they rolled him out, and he was like really good. And it was all like the whole thing was a big performance. And they pulled him back in, and then he was just like, So pretty bad stuff, pretty scandalous.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to go with my number 5 here. President Tyler annexes Texas. It's a little lesser known corner of our history, but it's something that I thought about recently because one of the Democrats in Congress was talking about DC statehood, and the Republicans said, you can't make a state out of it unless it's out of a territory. And someone was like, well, what about Texas? There was Texas. And I was like, it's not a great example, Texas, to bring up, because it's one of the most haphazard, disastrous, disorganized annexings of a state that led to a terrible war, the way it was done. And it was all Tyler's fault. James K. Polk didn't have to send troops all the way down to the Rio Grande, true, but it's really Tyler's fault that the Mexican War happens. And it's because of the way that he pursues annexation. It's just, so the first thing that happens is not his fault. He's got this great Secretary of State who's a really even-keeled guy. His name is Upshur, but Upshur gets killed in this really crazy accident with this gun that explodes on a ship and like fires shrapnel into a crowd. And Upshur happens to be in the crowd standing near the gun, and he gets killed. So he loses his Secretary of State who's negotiating the annexation of Texas. I should mention that Texas was an independent republic at this point in time. They had fought against the Mexican government, and they were able to declare their own republic. They had a constitution. They had a president, the whole thing. A lot of those guys were actually old Andrew Jackson friends of Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston and all those people, Tennessee people. Anyway, so Texas wanted to join the Union because it was going to have a much easier time being part of the Union than just being a small fledgling republic on its own, wedged between the United States and Mexico. And so they were applying for statehood, but they were also being very coy about it because they wanted to enter the Union on their own terms. So they were even suggesting they might join with Britain at one point to try to play those cards a little bit close to their chest and get a better deal. After Upshur dies, Tyler has the brilliant idea of appointing John C. Calhoun as his replacement. And Calhoun proceeds to ruin everything.
As he always does.
He starts raving and ranting in letters about how Texas is going to help the cause of slavery and advance the cause of slavery, which is sanctioned by God and is the most holiest of institutions that should not only be protected but spread around the world. It's and the letter gets these letters get published, they leak out, and everybody who thought that if anybody thought that this whole Texas thing was about advancing slavery, now that you have the Secretary of State who's negotiating the terms of annexation, explicitly saying that slavery is the number one reason to annex Texas. So this completely stymies the negotiations. It ruins everything. Tyler, who's staking his campaign for re-election on admitting Texas, is discredited. And it looks like he's out of the game, and that this Texas thing is just going to have to fall to the next president. But when James K. Polk gets elected, who is an expansionist and a pro-Texas guy, the momentum starts rolling again. And they have negotiations. They decide that the Congress decides not to admit Texas. And so they come up with a way to fast track the process by having a joint resolution passed that Tyler will just sign and be real quick, and we'll just get Texas in there under the radar. And it ends up going all the way up until the day before Polk gets inaugurated as president. Mm-hmm. And Tyler signs the Texas annexation the day before Polk becomes president. Mm-hmm. And so Polk comes into office, and now that's on his plate on day one. Mm-hmm. And so, you could argue that Tyler took something off of Polk's plate that would have been very difficult. But I think that if Polk had the opportunity to get in there, he could have probably figured out a way to negotiate things and maybe avoid a war with Mexico. But as it happened, Tyler basically gave him no option but to have war with Mexico by making this decision on his last day.
I'm going to use my save, and I'm going to disagree. And the reason is because I don't see what horrible consequence was there? I mean, we gained Texas, which probably if they had done a vote, they probably would have joined us anyway. Polk would have gone to war anyway, like whether Texas or not Texas. You remember I mean, and the Mexican War itself is very controversial because Grant said it was the most unjust war he'd ever seen in his life. Lincoln didn't agree with it. Lots of the wings didn't agree with it. But I think that the majority of Americans did agree with the Mexican War. And you know what? It doubled our territory as a nation. You know, countries aren't made on vanilla chocolate, vanilla ice cream. And I mean, it's the things that built our country are not pretty.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And, you know, and in terms of like the list of horrible things that we did, I don't know. I think that Texas joining our country and having our country just expand and being able to do the things that we did in that way, I don't think it's like the worst thing that happened. Although, I mean, you could make the argument that it empowered the South it basically set the groundwork for the South to do what they did later on, especially in the Confederacy and setting up the Confederacy by expanding slavery throughout the country. It obviously, I mean, if you just listening to Lincoln talk about the Mexican War, you get a sense that, yeah, this is kind of made up. Because I think that the Mexican soldiers fired on us, but not really. But I think it's more of like, I can see it going. I don't feel it to be as unjust as other things that we've done, and the long list of things that have been unjust.
I'm just saying that if Barack Obama was one day off from taking his oath of office and George Bush annexed Iraq as a state, you know, like that would not give Barack Obama a lot of discretion as to how he wanted to pursue his Iraq policy. I feel like Tyler, because of how bad of a job he did of trying to annex Texas, and then to do it right before, and Polk actually supported it, which I mean, but like to do it right before Polk gets in office, I mean, I just feel that perhaps there was a chance that Polk could have negotiated some land that with Mexico had Tyler not taken this provocative step that took an option off the table for Polk.
You know, it's interesting. I think that you've seen incidences like this in the past where presidents make lame duck decisions that, you know, the other president either kind of doesn't support or kind of does support, but doesn't want to talk about it. And so, for example, the thing that pops off the top of my head, it was that for immigration policy, it used to be that Cubans, if they landed here in America, they automatically got their green card or got their ability to stay in the country. And Obama kind of got rid of that really in the lame duck session, but Trump never brought it back. I think there's lots of examples in history where presidents are kind of like, I'm glad you took care of that. Yeah. Or even like moving the U.S. Capitol or the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That was something that, you know what, Biden's not changing that because he's glad he did it. And I think that in many ways, I think Polk is probably glad that Tyler did this in his own inept way, because of it, he could basically say, okay, he did it, so I can't do anything about it. So now I'm just going to basically take advantage of it.
All right. I guess I have a higher opinion of Polk than Tyler, and I would have rather had Polk do it.
You should not. Polk was probably the worst slaveholding president we had.
Oh, well, they were both slaveholders, though. I mean,
right, yeah. I mean, I guess you can't really do a degrees of who's like the worst slaveholder, but Polk was kind of a dick at the end of the day. So, right,
but I mean, he was a better president than Tyler.
He was a better president. That is true. Yeah. But I do think that Polk wouldn't have changed anything because he was a better president. I think that there was nothing he would have done differently had Tyler annexed or not annexed Texas. But you know what? We shouldn't disagree in front of the kids.
Yeah. Well, we might disagree on the next one because I'm surprised you picked Ford pardoning Nixon as one of your worst.
Yeah. And look, I get it. So just for those who don't know, President Nixon committed all these crimes, and a month after he leaves office and Ford becomes the president, Ford decides to pardon him of all crimes or whatever. And I think that for most of Americans, they think of that as, oh, that's so good. The country could move on. The country could like put all this stuff behind us. For me, I really think of Ford's pardon as giving a license to every president after him to kind of do whatever the hell they want. Right? Like, I think that had we seen the spectacle of an American president on trial and in jail, maybe you wouldn't have had the Iraq War. Maybe you wouldn't have had Trump doing all this stupid shit. maybe you wouldn't have had Reagan doing Iran-Contra. If presidents actually felt that there were consequences for their making, maybe we would have avoided a lot of the things that presidents do that make them feel like kings. I also think it set a bad precedent because basically no president after that really could do the things that needed to be done, right? And so like after Obama wins, everyone is like, dude, like, why is no one being punished for Iraq? Why is no one being punished for financial crisis? And Obama's answer is like, well, look at Ford pardoning Nixon. We have to move on as a country. Johnny, there are some things in our country we don't need to move on from. There are things that we need to talk about. There are things that we need to see done. If I sold a gram of marijuana or cocaine, this country would gladly see my black ass in jail. These people sent America into a war where we spent trillions of dollars and not a single person is on jail, based on a lie, WMD, not a single person is in jail. Nixon's running a criminal operation out of the White House. No one goes like, well, he doesn't go to jail for that, you know? These people who committed all of these financial crimes that led to the 2008 meltdown of our economy, no one goes to jail for that. And I think it's because so many Americans are like, well, we have to move on. We have to move on. No, you don't have to move on. If I commit a crime, you're not telling me just to move on. You don't go like, well, you know what, Chris, it's okay. It's okay that you sold that marijuana, which we're now building businesses about. It's okay. You know what? Let's move on. No. And so for like little petty minor crimes, this country is all about retribution, all about throwing your ass under the jail. But if you commit a really, really big crime, like being president and running a criminal operation, or you decide that you're going to get us into a war based on a lie, or you decide that you're going to encourage a mob to invade the Capitol, you don't feel any consequences of that punishment. And I think it's largely because Ford said, well, these problems are too big for us to actually deal with. And I think it's also an insult to the American people in a way, because it's basically a message that you people aren't smart enough or efficient enough or honest enough to deal with these problems. And I get the counter argument that you're going to make. Well, you know what? If you allow one president to go to jail, then they'll all go to jail. Fine. You know what? If the Republicans want to put Barack Obama on trial, put his ass on trial, right? And if he goes to jail for something unjust, that's on you, America, right? You shouldn't like let the fear of a good president go to jail permit you to let all these horrible presidents to remain free. That's the thing. If you're a bad president and you do objectively bad shit, you should be in jail, just like I would be in jail if I committed a crime. I think that we really have to think about what Ford did by pardoning Nixon and allowing the rest of these presidents afterward, and us as a country to think, well, you know what, the president's too big to fail. No, let him fail. Let him go to jail. And I guarantee you, if we see Trump, if American people see Trump in jail, if they see Nixon in jail, if they see all these other presidents in jail, maybe when I run for president, I'm going to think twice and be like, maybe I shouldn't lead a mob on the Capitol. Maybe I shouldn't run a criminal enterprise. Maybe I should think twice about the way we get us into war. I think it's a mechanism of making Americans think and making presidents think long and hard about the decisions that they make. And that's something that we desperately need. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's just that I think of the Pandora's box that it would open because, and you've already anticipated my counter argument, which is that, there is something to jail every president for, and the presidency itself is an office. It's not an individual person, and so it's difficult to pin something that an office does on a single individual. So like if you're talking about throwing George Bush in jail for invading Iraq, it's like, if you put George Bush on trial, he could very easily say, well, look, I was elected to protect the country. This was the information we were getting from the CIA. Maybe you should put them on trial. And we were getting this information from the FBI. Maybe you should put them on trial. Also, Dick Cheney told me this, and I did that. And this other person,
maybe put him on trial.
The ground, and like it gets.
Right.
It turns out it's a network, a web that leads to ultimately to the decision that the president makes. And so
but then you have presidents who will make the same mistake over and over and over again. You can't get us into war based on lies. You shouldn't. You should be punished for that. You can't encourage a mob to invade the Capitol. You should be punished for that. And you shouldn't run a criminal enterprise out of the White House, right? Like, again, I do something minorly bad. you're willing to throw me in jail for 30, 40, 50 years, the rest of my life, over something that is harmless. You caused trillions of dollars in debt, and you kill, and your actions lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of our soldiers. And it's like, well, you're too big to go to jail.
I do think that the fact that any leader could be thrown in jail because every leader does something that is like well beyond a petty crime, and at some point in their leadership of any government in every history. So if you want to make an argument for anarchism, that's fine. Like no government, no leadership. But if you're gonna have a government and a leadership, you need to. It's kind of like if you're a doctor, there has to be some level where you can't be held responsible for making mistakes. You have to have some kind of protections because you're going to kill people.
So if Donald Trump got in a tank and drove it down to the Capitol, burned the Capitol, went in there and seized power, you're telling me that he shouldn't go to jail because, well, some future president might also be put on trial for a lesser crime.
Well, if he did that, he wouldn't be put on trial because he'd seized power. So
let's say that he failed. Let's say that he failed.
Okay. He rode into a tank and it failed.
Yep.
I mean,
so he shouldn't be in jail because we don't want to and also it's not that it would lead to anarchy. It's just that America selectively picks and chooses what horrible thing they decide they want to punish people over, right? And so slavery, you know what? So it's just like, it's not like, and I also think that look, if you put Barack Obama on trial for some BS, I think he's going to get off on it, right? And also that let the process play out, right? Nixon might not have gone to jail. He might have actually beat the rap. You know what? Maybe the evidence, maybe everything would have been there, but let him actually go through the process. Let us as a country go through it without someone telling us, no, you're not big enough to deal with this, or that we as a country, it would open too many mirrors and halls about the horrors of a president going to jail. Yeah. Anyway, we again don't want to fight in front of the kids.
No, I mean, I when I look at the history from Ford's perspective, I don't see him making any other decision. I'll put it that way. Yeah. Whether it was the right decision or not, I don't see Ford ever deciding anything else. I mean, he needed to get on with his presidency. He didn't want the whole next, 3 years to be a trial of Richard Nixon, and he wanted to get reelected. So he had self-serving reasons as well. But in the end, I've said my objections. You've said your side. I think it's fair to say Gerald Ford wasn't going to make any other decision than that. And so,
and God bless him. Everyone says it's the greatest decision ever, but I actually think it was one of the worst.
Jimmy Carter, he said, "Thank you, President Ford, for all you've done to heal our land."
Heal our land, yeah. You did say that, sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris Richardson, for coming today to talk about the worst presidential decisions in history. And hopefully we'll come back again with another crazy top 5 topic like we always do. But thanks, everybody, for checking in on the chat. And if you want to watch this from the beginning, it will be automatically uploaded to YouTube. So check it out.